Have you ever wondered where civilization in the Americas truly began? Long before the Aztec Empire rose in the Valley of Mexico, before the Maya carved their temples deep in the jungles of the Yucatan, there were other peoples, older, quieter, but no less extraordinary. They were the builders of the first cities, the dreamers who shaped stone into gods, the visionaries who gave Mesoamerica its heartbeat. This is where it all began in ancient Mexico, the birthplace of civilization in the New World. Thousands of years ago, long before history was written, this land was already alive with human movement. Families migrated across rivers and mountains, hunting animals, gathering plants, and slowly learning to cultivate the land. It was here, around 7,000 years before the birth of Christ, that people discovered how to grow maize, corn. It might sound simple now, but this moment changed everything. With corn came stability. With stability came villages. And with villages came the idea that humans could shape the world around them. Over time, small settlements appeared near rivers and fertile valleys. People began to build homes that lasted, shrines for their gods, and spaces for trade. The first artists carved clay into figures, and the first priests looked to the skies to measure time. They saw patterns in the stars, and believed the heavens spoke to them. These early beliefs would guide every great civilization that followed. From these roots grew the first great culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs, known today as the mother culture of all who came after. The Olmecs appeared around 1500 BCE in the tropical lowlands along the Gulf of Mexico, in what is now Veracruz and Tabasco. Their homeland was a world of rivers, swamps, and forests. To most, it would have seemed an untamable land, but to the Olmecs, it was a sacred landscape, full of life and divine power. Here they built their great centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, places that would become the heart of early civilization. Imagine standing in San Lorenzo 3,000 years ago. The air is thick with humidity. The smell of earth and rain fills the air. People move through busy plazas, carrying baskets of maize and fish from the rivers. At the city's center rises a platform of clay and stone, topped by temples and statues of their rulers. And scattered across the site are colossal heads, massive stones, some taller than a man, each carved into the likeness of an ancient king. Their faces are strong, their expressions calm, their helmets carved with intricate detail. Each one weighs up to 40 tons, and yet the Olmecs transported them for miles, without the wheel or beasts of burden. No one knows exactly how they did it, but their purpose is clear. They were monuments to power, to divinity, to the belief that rulers were connected to the gods themselves. The Olmecs were not just builders, they were thinkers, artists, and spiritual visionaries. Their art is among the most mysterious in the ancient world. Human figures with jaguar features, infants with supernatural expressions, beings that seem to exist between worlds. These images reflected their belief in transformation, that humans and gods, life and death, were connected through sacred balance. The jaguar, powerful and elusive, was their symbol of strength, fertility, and the spirit world. Their society revolved around religion. The Olmec world was divided into three realms: the sky above, the earth in the middle, and the watery underworld below. Mountains were sacred because they connected all three. Rivers were pathways to the spiritual world. Priests, dressed in jaguar pelts and adorned with jade, performed ceremonies to keep the universe in balance. They believed everything from the rain to the crops depended on pleasing the gods. And it was not just faith that made them powerful, it was knowledge. The Olmecs were among the first in the Americas to develop systems of writing and calendars. On carved stones, archaeologists have found symbols that may represent words, names, and dates, early signs of written language. They studied the movements of the sun and the stars, predicting seasons and guiding farmers. They were creating order out of nature, turning observation into science, belief into structure. Trade was the lifeblood of the Olmec world. From their homeland on the Gulf Coast, they built vast networks that reached across Mesoamerica. Traders carried obsidian, jade, iron ore, feathers, and cacao. They traveled by river and foot, exchanging not only goods but ideas, and wherever the Olmecs went, their art and symbols followed. The Olmec influence reached far beyond their borders, touching the highlands of central Mexico, the valleys of Oaxaca, and even the early Maya lands. You can see their mark in other cultures' art, architecture, and religious symbols. But no civilization lasts forever. Around 400 BCE, the great Olmec centers began to decline. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps floods changed the rivers they depended on. Perhaps wars or internal struggles weakened their rulers. Or maybe the fertile lands could no longer sustain their growing population. Whatever the reason, the great cities fell silent. The jungles reclaimed them. Yet the Olmec spirit did not vanish. Their ideas, their gods, art, and sense of cosmic order would live on in every civilization that followed. Centuries later, far from the humid lowlands, a new people rose among the mountains, the Zapotecs. They built their cities high above the valleys, where the air was cool and the view endless. Around 500 BCE, they began constructing what would become one of the most impressive cities in ancient Mexico. Monte Alban, built on a flattened mountaintop in the Oaxaca Valley. Monte Alban seemed to float above the clouds. It was both fortress and temple, city and sanctuary. In Monte Albanese plazas, priests and nobles walked among temples aligned with the stars. The Zapotecs were astronomers, studying the heavens to mark the passage of time. They built observatories to track the movement of the sun and moon, using the sky to plan their rituals and crops. They also developed one of the earliest systems of writing in the Americas, carving glyphs into stone. Some of these carvings, known as danzantes, depict human figures in strange poses, possibly dancers or captured warriors. Others include names and dates, evidence that the Zapotecs recorded their history and honored their dead. Monte Alban was a city of order and ceremony. At its center stood grand plazas surrounded by temples, palaces, and ball courts. From here, the Zapotec rulers governed not just the city but the surrounding valleys. They organized their society into classes, nobles and priests at the top, craftsmen and farmers below. Religion was everywhere. Every building, every ceremony, every battle was dedicated to maintaining harmony between the gods and humanity. Like the Olmecs, the Zapotecs believed in the sacred balance of life. They worshipped gods of rain, maize, and fertility, and believed their rulers could communicate with these divine forces. Rituals often involved offerings, dance, and sometimes human sacrifice acts meant to feed the gods and ensure the survival of their people. Trade once again connected cultures. The Zapotecs exchanged goods with neighboring peoples, obsidian from the Valley of Mexico, shells from the Pacific coast, and jade from the south. Through trade, they spread not only materials but ideas. Their influence reached far, and their art and writing inspired later cultures, including the Mixtecs, who would eventually inhabit Monte Alban after the Zapotecs. As centuries passed, the Zapotec civilization changed and adapted. Monte Alban grew, then declined, as power shifted to new centers, but the city's temples and carvings remained, watching silently over the valleys, reminders of a people who mastered both the heavens and the earth. Centuries later, another civilization emerged in the heart of Mexico, one that would leave a legend so powerful it would echo into myth. Around the 9th century CE, the Toltecs rose in the central highlands. They called their capital Tolan, known today as Tula. Here, amid dry plains and cactus-covered hills, they built a city of warriors, thinkers, and artists. To the Aztecs who came long after, the Toltecs were not just ancestors, they were the very embodiment of wisdom and civilization. In Aztec memory, the Toltecs were the ones who taught humanity how to live, how to build, how to pray, how to rule. Their name became synonymous with artistry and perfection. To be called Toltec was to be called wise. At Tula, the Toltecs built grand temples, ball courts, and palaces. On one pyramid stand, the famous stone warriors' massive basalt statues, known as Atlanteans. They stand tall and silent, each holding weapons and shields, guardians of their city and symbols of strength. From these heights, the Toltecs ruled over a vast region, spreading their influence through trade and conquest. Their society was both disciplined and deeply spiritual. They worshipped gods of creation, war, and the elements, but none was more revered than Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was the god of wind, learning, and civilization, the bringer of life and knowledge. According to Toltec legend, Quetzalcoatl once ruled Tula as a benevolent priest-king. He taught the people art, science, and peace. But his rival, Tezcatlipoca, the god of night and sorcery, tricked him and drove him into exile. Heartbroken, Quetzalcoatl left the city, sailing eastward toward the sea, promising to return one day. That legend would live on for centuries and later shape the Aztecs' understanding of fate when they saw foreign ships arrive from the east. The myth of Quetzalcoatl wasn't just a story, it was a mirror of human hope and loss, of the rise and fall of great powers. Like those before them, the Toltecs eventually fell. Tula was destroyed, perhaps by internal conflict or invading tribes. Its temples crumbled, its warriors silenced, but their legacy endured. The Aztecs adopted much of their culture, their gods, their symbols, their architectural styles. Even their myths became part of the Aztec worldview. When you look across these centuries, from the Olmecs to the Zapotecs to the Toltecs, a pattern emerges. Each civilization inherited something from the one before, transforming it, refining it, making it their own. The Olmecs gave the blueprint, the idea of sacred kingship, cosmic balance, and art as a form of worship. The Zapotecs added structure and writing, turning faith into record in history. The Toltecs added myth and legend, blending power with philosophy. Together, they built the foundations of what would later become the Aztec and Maya worlds, civilizations that saw themselves, not as new but as continuations of an ancient story. Even today, the remains of these first civilizations still speak. The colossal heads of the Olmecs still stare through the jungle, timeless and proud. The terraces of Monte Alban still stand high above the valleys, their stones warm under the sun. The statues of Tula still face the horizon, silent and eternal. They remind us that long before the pyramids of Teotihuacan or the empire of the Aztecs, Mexico was already a land of thinkers, artists, and dreamers. Ancient Mexico was never a single culture or kingdom. It was a living tapestry of peoples connected by trade, faith, and creativity. Across jungles, deserts, and mountains, they shared the same questions. Where do we come from? What lies beyond the stars? How can we live in balance with the gods? Their answers were written not in books, but in stone, in art, in ritual. And those answers still whisper through the ruins they left behind. From the first farmer planting maize, to the sculptor carving a god from basalt, every hand helped build the foundation of Mesoamerica. Civilization here was not born overnight. It grew slowly, carried by vision and belief, from one people to the next. The Olmecs lit the spark, the Zapotecs carried the flame, the Toltecs turned it into legend, and together, they gave rise to one of the most fascinating stories in human history, the birth of civilization in ancient Mexico. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, where the air is heavy with rain and time seems to move slower, lies the memory of a civilization unlike any other. The Maya. Their cities rose from the earth like dreams of stone and light. For nearly 2,000 years, they built, studied, and created a world where science, art, and faith intertwined so perfectly that even today, we still struggle to understand how they achieved it. To the ancient Maya, the world was alive with meaning. Every star in the sky, every drop of rain, every shadow on the temple wall was part of a great cosmic story. They believed time itself was sacred, a living cycle, repeating endlessly, and they built their entire civilization around that idea. The Maya world stretched across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It was not one empire ruled by a single king, but a collection of powerful city-states, each with its own ruler, gods, and ambitions. Together, they formed one of the most brilliant and complex societies the ancient world ever saw. The origins of the Maya go back to the same roots that fed the Olmecs and the Zapotecs. Around 1000 BCE, small villages began to grow in the fertile lowlands and highlands of Mesoamerica. These early communities built modest temples, raised crops of maize and beans, and traded along rivers and coasts. Over centuries, they developed their own writing, art, and mathematics. By around 250 CE, the Maya entered what we now call their classic period, the golden age of their civilization. This was when their cities reached their peak, when their temples touched the sky, and when their scholars mapped the heavens. Imagine approaching one of these cities at its height, perhaps Tikal, deep in the Guatemalan rainforest. From a distance, its massive pyramids rise like mountains from the jungle. Stone staircases climb toward the sky. Carved stelae stand in the plazas, covered in mysterious glyphs and images of kings in elaborate headdresses. The air smells of incense and wet leaves. Drums echo through the trees as priests climb the steps to offer sacrifices to the gods. At its height, Tikal was home to tens of thousands of people, nobles, warriors, artisans, and farmers, all living within a carefully ordered society ruled by divine kings. Each Maya city-state was both a political and religious center. The ruler wasn't just a king. He was believed to be the bridge between humanity and the gods. His blood was sacred, his actions cosmic. When he went to war, it wasn't only for power or land. It was to feed the gods with the energy of life. Bloodletting rituals were central to Maya belief. Kings and queens would pierce their tongues or skin, offering their own blood to renew the universe. These acts of devotion were seen as necessary to maintain harmony between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. But the Maya were not only warriors and priests, they were scientists, mathematicians, and artists of extraordinary skill. They developed one of the most advanced writing systems in the ancient world, a complex script made of hundreds of glyphs that combined pictures and phonetic sounds. Using this script, they recorded history, mythology, royal lineages, and even astronomical observations. Their texts were painted on bark paper books called codices and carved into stone monuments that still stand today. Through their writing, the Maya preserved a deep understanding of time. They didn't see time as a straight line, but as an eternal cycle of creation, destruction, and renewal. Their calendar system was one of their greatest achievements. They used several calendars at once: the sacred 260-day ritual calendar called the Tizocan, the 365-day solar calendar called the Hob, and the long count, which measured the passage of great cycles of thousands of years. Their calculations were so precise that they could predict eclipses and track the movement of planets with remarkable accuracy. At night, Maya astronomers watched the stars from the tops of temples. They saw the planet Venus as a powerful symbol of war and rebirth, and they aligned their buildings to follow its path across the sky. They studied the sun, the moon, and the Milky Way, believing each movement reflected the will of the gods. Their entire civilization was synchronized with the cosmos. Cities aligned with solstices, rituals timed to the stars, and architecture built as a reflection of the heavens. If Tikal was the beating heart of the Maya world, then Palenque was its soul. Nestled among mist-covered hills in modern-day Chiapas, Palenque was smaller but known for its elegance and artistry. It was home to one of the most famous Maya rulers, Kanich, Janab, Pakal, or Pakal the Great. Under his reign in the 7th century CE, Palenque flourished. He built magnificent palaces, intricate temples, and monuments covered in carvings that tell his life story. His tomb, discovered deep within the Temple of the Inscriptions, remains one of the greatest archaeological finds in the Americas. A stone sarcophagus decorated with symbols of rebirth, surrounded by jade and treasures meant to accompany him into the afterlife. Each Maya city was unique, but all shared the same vision: to bring the divine order of the universe into the world of man. Their architecture reflected this belief. Pyramids were built as sacred mountains connecting heaven and earth. Temples and palaces were placed with mathematical precision to align with celestial events. The result was a landscape that was not only beautiful but symbolic. Every stone, every shadow, every sound carried meaning. Far to the north, in the Yucatan Peninsula, another great city rose: Chichen Itza, founded centuries after Tikal. Chichen Itza became one of the most powerful Maya cities during the post-classic period. It was a center of trade, religion, and innovation. At its heart stood the Great Pyramid known as El Castillo, dedicated to the feathered serpent god, Kukulkan, the Maya version of Quetzalcoatl. The pyramid was more than a monument. It was a cosmic calendar carved in stone. Each of its 4 sides has 91 steps, totaling 364, with the top platform making 365, one for every day of the solar year. Twice a year, on the spring and autumn equinoxes, something remarkable happens. As the sun sets, the pyramid's edges cast shadows that form the shape of a serpent, slithering down its side, connecting the heavens to the earth. For the Maya, this was not coincidence but design proof that they had mastered both architecture and astronomy to a level rarely seen in the ancient world. Chichen Itza was also a city of warriors and merchants. It had ball courts where ritual games were played to honor the gods, and sometimes to decide the fate of captives. The losers, or in some cases, the winners, were sacrificed as offerings. It had observatories to study the stars, markets filled with goods from distant lands, and temples covered in carvings that tell stories of conquest and faith. The Maya world was rich and diverse. Some cities, like Tikal and Palenque, were deep in the jungles. Others, like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, were in the open plains of the Yucatan. Despite their differences, they were all connected through trade routes that stretched hundreds of miles. Obsidian, jade, cacao, feathers, and salt flowed between them. Ideas, art, and beliefs moved just as freely. It was a world of movement and exchange, united not by a single empire, but by shared traditions and an understanding of cosmic order. Yet even in their greatness, the Maya were never far from conflict. City-states often went to war, sometimes to capture territory, sometimes for tribute, and often for religious reasons. War was part of the divine cycle, a necessary act to maintain balance. Captives were offered to the gods, their blood feeding the sun so it would rise again. These conflicts were brutal, but they were also deeply symbolic. They weren't fought just for power but for meaning. As centuries passed, the Maya world reached its height, and then, slowly, it began to change. Around the 9th century CE, one by one, the great southern cities began to fall silent. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, places that had stood for centuries, were abandoned. The jungle began to reclaim them, vines wrapping around stone, rain washing over carvings, until the gods themselves seemed to disappear into the earth. Historians have debated for decades why the Maya civilization declined. Some point to environmental collapse, droughts, deforestation, and overfarming that exhausted the land. Others suggest internal conflict, warfare that tore apart alliances and drained resources. Perhaps disease, famine, or rebellion played a role. It may have been all of these together, a perfect storm that slowly unraveled the world the Maya had built. But their story did not end there. Even as the southern cities fell, new centers rose in the north. Chichen Itza flourished, followed by Miopan and others. The Maya adapted, surviving through trade and migration. When the Spanish arrived centuries later, in the 1500s, they found not a lost people, but a living culture. The Maya had changed, but they were still there, still farming, still carving, still speaking the languages of their ancestors. The arrival of the Spanish brought devastation. Disease and conquest destroyed kingdoms that had lasted for centuries. The codices, the books that contained Maya knowledge, were burned by missionaries who saw them as works of the devil. Only a few survived, fragile fragments of a vast intellectual world, yet the spirit of the Maya endured. Their descendants still live across Central America today, keeping their traditions alive, in their weaving, their stories, and their languages. When we look at what the Maya created, it's impossible not to feel awe. They built cities that rivaled any in the ancient world. They charted the stars, invented complex mathematics that included the concept of zero, and developed writing capable of recording poetry and prophecy. Their architecture still confounds engineers. Their calendars still fascinate scientists. They left behind a record of human potential, of what people can achieve when they see the world not just as a place to live, but as a sacred connection between the earth and the cosmos. The story of the Maya is a story of brilliance and mystery, of rise and fall, of endurance beyond time. Their cities may have crumbled, their kings may be gone, but their vision, the idea that time is eternal and that humanity is part of something far greater, remains. The jungle still guards their temples, the stars still move across the same sky they once studied, and their descendants still speak the same words that echoed through their ancient plazas. As the light fades over the ruins of Tikal, the calls of howler monkeys echo through the trees. Mist drifts over the temples, and for a moment, it feels as if the past is still alive, as if the priests might return to light their incense and speak to the gods once more. The Maya are not gone. They are simply waiting, in the stones, in the stars, and in the timeless rhythm of their world. Imagine a vast city shimmering on a lake, its stone temples rising high above the water, its markets alive with thousands of voices, and causeways stretching out like arms connecting it to the mainland. This was Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, one of the greatest cities the ancient world had ever seen. But the story of this empire begins long before its towers pierced the sky. It begins with a wandering people who called themselves the Mexico. Centuries ago, before they became known as the Aztecs, the Mexico were nomads searching for a home. They traveled across the valleys of central Mexico, guided by their god Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. Legend tells that their god promised them a land where they would see a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. For generations they wandered, often rejected by more powerful tribes, but they carried with them a fierce spirit, a belief that they were destined for greatness. Then, around 1325, they found it. On a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they saw the eagle, just as the prophecy foretold. To others, it was a swampy, inhospitable place, but to the Mexica, it was sacred ground. There, they began to build what would become Tenochtitlan, a city unlike any other in the Americas. At first, it was humble, a few huts, small temples, and floating gardens called chinampas, but the Mexica were clever engineers. They learned to control the lake, to create farmland on water by weaving reeds, piling mud, and anchoring it all with trees. Over time, the chinampas stretched far and wide, producing enough maize, beans, and chili to feed a growing population. As the city expanded, the Mexica's strength and ambition grew too. They didn't stay isolated for long. Through alliances and conquests, they began to dominate neighboring city-states. By the early 15th century, under the leadership of its Coatl, the Mexica joined forces with two powerful allies, Texcoco and Tlacopan, forming the famous Triple Alliance. This alliance became the foundation of the Aztec Empire. Soon, armies marched under banners marked with eagles and suns, spreading Aztec power across the Valley of Mexico and beyond. Tributes of gold, jade, cacao, cotton, and precious feathers flowed into Tenochtitlan from hundreds of conquered cities. At the height of its power, Tenochtitlan was breathtaking. Spanish accounts later described it as cleaner, larger, and more organized than any city in Europe at the time. Wide causeways crossed the lake, connecting the island city to the mainland. Stone aqueducts brought fresh water from distant springs. Markets like Tlatelolco hosted as many as 60,000 people a day, trading everything from obsidian blades to tropical fruits. Canals cut through the city, carrying canoes filled with goods and people. The air was filled with the smell of food cooking, the sounds of merchants calling, and the rhythm of drums echoing from temple tops. At its center rose the Templo Mayor, a towering double pyramid dedicated to two gods, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. Together they represented the balance between destruction and life, between war and harvest. The Aztecs believed the sun's journey across the sky was not guaranteed. To keep it alive, they had to feed it, not with offerings of crops or gold, but with blood. They believed human life was the ultimate gift to the gods, the fuel that kept the universe in motion. This belief shaped Aztec religion and politics alike. Captives from war were not always killed in battle. They were brought back to the capital to be offered to the gods atop the Templo Mayor. To modern eyes, it may seem brutal, but for the Aztecs, it was sacred duty, an act of cosmic balance. In their worldview, without sacrifice, the sun would die, the world would end, and all life would fall into darkness. The Aztec Empire was not just built on war though. It was sustained by an intricate political and social system. The emperor, or Huitzilopochtli, meaning great speaker, ruled as both king and divine representative. Beneath him were nobles, priests, merchants, artisans, and farmers. Education was mandatory, a rare thing in the ancient world. Boys learned warfare and farming, girls learned weaving and domestic arts, and priests taught history, law, and religion. Even commoners understood their role in maintaining the harmony of the universe. The Aztecs were also remarkable builders and artists. Their temples and palaces were covered with carvings depicting gods, serpents, and celestial scenes. They crafted intricate jewelry of gold and turquoise, painted codices filled with history and myth, and composed poetry about love, death, and destiny. The featherwork of the Aztecs was among the most exquisite art forms, shimmering cloaks and headdresses made from the feathers of tropical birds, worn by priests and nobles as symbols of divine power. Their calendar system, inherited and refined from earlier civilizations like the Maya, was incredibly precise. It combined two cycles, one of 260 days for ritual and another of 365 for solar events. Every 52 years, when the cycles met, the Aztecs feared the world might end. Great ceremonies were held to renew the fire of the sun, ensuring life would continue for another cycle. This deep connection between religion, time, and the cosmos defined their civilization. But for all their strength and sophistication, the Aztecs were also feared by many of their neighbors. Their empire demanded heavy tribute, and their hunger for sacrificial victims was endless. These tensions would later shape their fate. By the early 1500s, under the rule of Montezuma II, the Aztec Empire stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. Millions lived under its control. Tenochtitlan had become the jewel of Mesoamerica, a city of beauty, wealth, and power. Yet beneath the surface, unrest simmered. Conquered peoples resented their rulers. The empire, powerful as it was, stood on uneasy foundations. Then, in 1519, strange ships appeared on the eastern coast. From them came pale-skinned men clad in metal, riding animals never seen before. Their leader was Hernan Cortes, a Spanish conquistador driven by ambition, faith, and greed. To the Aztecs, these newcomers were both fascinating and terrifying. Some believed they were connected to prophecy, perhaps messengers from the gods, or even gods themselves returning from the east. Montezuma hesitated, unsure whether to welcome or confront them. Cortes, however, wasted no time. He formed alliances with tribes long oppressed by the Aztecs, including the powerful Tlaxcolans, who saw in the Spaniards a chance for revenge. With their help, he marched toward the capital. As Cortes and his army approached Tenochtitlan, they were astonished by what they saw: the gleaming city on the water, its temples rising in the mist, its streets clean and organized. Bernal Diaz, a soldier in Cortes' ranks, later wrote that it was like seeing something from a dream. When Cortes finally entered the city, Montezuma welcomed him as an honored guest, but peace could not last. Cultural misunderstanding, fear, and ambition quickly turned to conflict. Within months, violence erupted. The Spaniards seized Montezuma, chaos spread through the streets, and the fragile balance that had sustained the empire for centuries began to crumble. After fierce battles, betrayals, and the deadly arrival of smallpox, a disease brought unknowingly by the Europeans, Tenochtitlan fell in. 1521. Its temples were destroyed, its people enslaved or killed, and its canals filled with rubble. From the ashes of that magnificent city, the Spanish built Mexico City, erasing much of what once stood. Yet the spirit of the Aztecs did not vanish. It lived on in memory, in legend, and in the hearts of their descendants. The Aztec Empire had risen from nothing, from a swampy island and a prophecy, to become one of the greatest civilizations in the Americas. Its fall was tragic, but its legacy endures. In the Mexican flag, where the eagle still stands on the cactus devouring a serpent. In the Nahuatl language still spoken by millions. And in the deep cultural pride that connects modern Mexico to its ancient past. The story of the Aztecs is not just one of power and conquest, but of creativity, resilience, and belief. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires can rise from the humblest beginnings, and that their stories, once told, never truly die. When the Spanish ships appeared off the coast of Mexico in 1519, no one could have imagined how quickly the world would change. From the decks of those ships stepped a small band of men, a few hundred soldiers, some armed with crossbows, others with steel swords and cannons that thundered like gods. At their head was Hernan Cortes, a man both brilliant and ruthless, driven by ambition, faith, and a hunger for glory. What he was about to begin would alter the fate of an empire and reshape the history of an entire continent. The Spanish had come from Cuba, sailing westward after hearing rumors of a mighty empire rich in gold. Cortes was not just chasing treasure, he was chasing destiny. Against orders from the governor of Cuba, he led his men inland, believing that fortune favored the bold. As they landed near modern-day Veracruz, they were met by local tribes who watched in awe at these pale-skinned strangers clad in shining metal and mounted on beasts no one in Mesoamerica had ever seen, horses. To the native peoples, the Spaniards seemed almost supernatural. Cortes quickly learned that the land he had entered was not united. The Aztec Empire ruled many tribes, but its control was built on fear, tribute, and resentment. Conquered peoples were forced to send goods, crops, and even captives to Tenochtitlan. Many of them longed for revenge. Cortes saw opportunity in their hatred. Through interpreters, first a Spanish priest, and then La Malinche, an enslaved native woman who became his translator, advisor, and crucial ally, Cortes began forming relationships with local leaders. La Malinche, fluent in both Maya and Nahuatl, became his voice, his bridge to the indigenous world. To some, she would later be seen as a traitor. To others, as a survivor caught in the tide of history. Cortes moved inland, making alliances with tribes like the Totonacs and later the Tlaxcolans, fierce warriors who had resisted Aztec domination for generations. At first, the Tlaxcalans fought the Spaniards in bloody battles, but when they saw the firepower and determination of Cortes' men, they chose alliance over annihilation. Together, they plotted to bring down the empire that had oppressed them. As they marched through the mountains and valleys, toward the Valley of Mexico, stories of these strangers spread. Some said they were divine beings. Others believed they were the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, who, according to prophecy, would come from the east. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II received these reports with growing unease. He was a deeply spiritual man, cautious and intelligent, but torn between fear and duty. Unsure of whether these visitors were gods or men, he chose to observe rather than attack. When Cortes and his army finally reached the lake, they beheld Tenochtitlan, a city so magnificent that even the hardened soldiers were left speechless. Rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, its temples gleamed in the sun, its streets were alive with color, and its causeways stretched across the water like veins. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of Cortes' men, later wrote that it was like seeing something from a fairy tale. Montezuma welcomed Cortes with gifts of gold, silver, and precious stones, hoping to appease the strangers and perhaps understand their true nature. Cortes, however, saw these offerings not as diplomacy but as weakness. He accepted Montezuma's hospitality and soon after took him prisoner within his own palace. The emperor who had ruled millions was suddenly a hostage in his own city. At first, the Spaniards maintained the illusion of peace, but tensions grew quickly. The Aztec nobles resented the presence of foreign invaders, and the Spanish soldiers, greedy and restless, grew impatient. Then, while Cortes was away dealing with a rival Spanish expedition sent to arrest him, his men in Tenochtitlan committed a massacre during a religious festival at the Templo Mayor. Hundreds of unarmed Aztecs were slaughtered while dancing and singing to their gods. When word spread, the city exploded in fury. Cortes returned to chaos. The streets of Tenochtitlan had turned against him. His soldiers were trapped, surrounded by warriors hurling spears and stones from rooftops. Montezuma was brought out to speak to his people, but he was struck down by his own subjects, who now saw him as a puppet of the invaders. The once great emperor was dead, and the Spanish were forced to flee the city in a desperate escape, known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Many drowned in the lake, weighed down by the gold they had tried to carry. Yet Cortes was not finished. He regrouped in Tlaxcala, gathered reinforcements, and began preparing for the ultimate siege. Over the next months, he built alliances with more native tribes, assembled ships to control the lake, and planned to cut off Tenochtitlan's supplies. He knew that defeating the Aztecs meant not just overpowering them, but starving them into submission. Meanwhile, a silent killer swept through the land. Smallpox, the disease, carried unknowingly by one of Cortes' men, spread rapidly through the densely populated cities and villages of Mexico. The Aztecs had no immunity to it. It decimated entire communities, killing warriors, farmers, priests, and children alike. Even the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, fell victim to the plague. The empire was crippled from within, long before the final battle began. In May 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Spanish brigantines patrolled the lake, cutting off food and water routes. Allied native armies surrounded the city on land, tightening the noose day by day. Inside the walls, the Aztecs fought with unmatched courage. They rebuilt barricades, launched counterattacks, and fought for every causeway and bridge. But hunger and disease weakened them. The once proud capital became a place of suffering, its canals filled with corpses, its temples burning under cannon fire. Cortes pushed forward relentlessly. Block by block, the city fell. The defenders, led by Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor of the Aztecs, refused to surrender. He fought with honor, believing it was better to die defending his people than to live under foreign rule. On August 13, 1521, after 93 days of siege, Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape by canoe. The empire was finished. The city that had once been the jewel of Mesoamerica lay in ruins, its temples toppled, its people enslaved or dead. Cortes entered the ruins as conqueror. The victory was complete, but so was the destruction. He stood among the ashes of a civilization that had taken centuries to build and only 2 years to destroy. From those ruins, the Spanish began constructing a new world. Mexico City, built atop the bones of Tenochtitlan, the cross replaced the temples. The Spanish crown replaced the Aztec emperor. and the language of Castile replaced Nahuatl in government and law. Yet even in defeat, the legacy of the Aztecs did not die. Their art, their language, and their symbols survived, often hidden beneath layers of colonial rule. The image of the eagle and serpent, the very sign that had once guided the Mexica to their home, would one day rise again as the emblem of a new nation. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was more than the fall of a kingdom. It was the collision of two worlds, one ancient and deeply spiritual, the other armed with steel faith and an unshakable belief in its own destiny. It was a moment when courage and cruelty, faith and greed, destiny and destruction intertwined, and from that collision, a new chapter in history began, the birth of colonial Mexico, where two civilizations would merge, clash, and create the world we know today. When the smoke cleared over the ruins of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. The temples of the gods lay in rubble, the canals filled with ash and blood, and the sound of drums that once echoed across the lake had fallen silent. From this devastation, a new order rose, not an empire of the sun, but an empire of the cross. Mexico was no longer the land of the Mexica. It had become New Spain, a distant jewel in the crown of the Spanish Empire. Hernan Cortes wasted no time in securing his new domain. He ordered the construction of a new city directly atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, using the same stones that had once built Aztec temples to now raise cathedrals and palaces in the European style. The Cathedral of Mexico City began to rise where the Templo Mayor once stood, a powerful symbol that the old gods had fallen and a new faith had claimed their place. The Spanish saw it as divine triumph. For the surviving indigenous people, it was the beginning of centuries of struggle. Under Spanish rule, Mexico became the heart of a vast colonial network, stretching from California to Peru. Gold and silver mines fueled Spain's global wealth, turning New Spain into one of the most important colonies in the world. Ships loaded with treasure sailed from the ports of Veracruz and Acapulco, carrying riches across the Atlantic to Europe and across the Pacific to the Philippines. But behind the wealth were the hands of millions of indigenous laborers who toiled under brutal conditions, their lives reshaped by conquest and conversion. The Spanish crown imposed the encomienda system, granting conquistadors and settlers control over land and the native people living on it. In theory, these encomenderas were to protect and Christianize the indigenous population. In practice, the system became a form of slavery. Entire communities were forced to work in mines, fields, and workshops, often under deadly conditions. Families were torn apart, traditions were forbidden, and ancient ways of life began to disappear. But even amid oppression, the indigenous world did not vanish. The Catholic Church, which quickly became the most powerful institution in New Spain, brought missionaries who sought to convert the native population. They destroyed temples and idols, yet also built their churches on top of them, merging sacred spaces rather than erasing them completely. In many towns, the same stones that once formed pyramids were used to construct chapels, blending the old and the new in a way that even the Spanish could not fully control. Monks like the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits traveled deep into the countryside, founding missions, teaching agriculture, and recording indigenous languages and traditions. Some, like Bartolomé de las Casas, spoke out against the brutality of the system, arguing that the native people were not heathens but human beings deserving of dignity and justice. Yet the violence and exploitation continued for generations. Over time, something remarkable began to happen, a fusion of worlds. The Spanish brought their language, religion, and art. The indigenous peoples carried their symbols, colors, and beliefs. Together they gave birth to a new culture, one unlike anything seen before. Spanish saints were reimagined through native eyes, and old gods found new forms beneath Christian names. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared in 1531 to an indigenous man named Juan Diego, became the most powerful symbol of this blend, a figure both Catholic and deeply Mexican. Her dark skin, her language, and her message of compassion united people from all walks of life. Architecture, food, and art reflected this merging of worlds. European cathedrals rose beside adobe houses, Spanish music mixed with native rhythms, maize met wheat, and chocolate, once sacred to the Aztecs, became a luxury enjoyed by Europe's elite. In markets, Nahuatl words blended into Spanish speech, creating a new tongue, the voice of a new nation in the making. But beneath the surface of cultural blending lay deep divisions. Society in New Spain was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, who held the highest offices and wealth. Below them were the Creoles, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. Though they were often educated, wealthy, and loyal to Spain, they were denied the same privileges as their European counterparts. Beneath them were the mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and Spanish blood, who filled the growing middle class as artisans, merchants, and small farmers. At the bottom were the indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, who carried the weight of labor and taxation. Over the centuries, resentment grew among the Creoles. They saw themselves as true sons and daughters of the land, yet they were treated as outsiders in their own country. As Spain grew more powerful, it also grew distant, ruling its colonies through bureaucracy and greed. The church collected wealth, the crown demanded taxes, and the people of New Spain began to whisper of injustice. Education and ideas from Europe's Age of Enlightenment began to filter into the colony. Creole priests and scholars read about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. They studied the revolutions in America and France, and some began to imagine what it would mean for New Spain to stand on its own. But such thoughts were dangerous. For now, rebellion stayed hidden, buried beneath layers of faith and fear. Meanwhile, life continued in the towns and haciendas of New Spain. Great estates spread across the countryside, worked by indigenous laborers and African slaves. The church became not just a religious force but an economic one, owning vast tracts of land and influencing every aspect of daily life. Priests baptized children, married couples, buried the dead, and stood as both spiritual and political authorities. The sound of church bells marked the rhythm of existence, calling people to prayer, to work, to submission. Yet even in this tightly controlled world, resistance endured. Indigenous rebellions flared in remote regions, where people fought to preserve their customs and autonomy. Secret gatherings of Creoles discussed reform and independence. The seeds of revolution were being sown quietly, waiting for the right moment to rise. By the 17th and 18th centuries, New Spain had grown into one of the richest colonies in the world. Its capital, Mexico City, became a city of contrasts. Grand cathedrals beside crowded markets, noblemen in fine silks passing beggars in rags. It was a place where European elegance met indigenous resilience, where the past and present lived side by side. The mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato filled Spanish coffers with silver, while the hands that dug it out grew calloused and thin. As centuries passed, identity began to shift. People born in Mexico, whether Creole mestizo or indigenous, started to see themselves not just as subjects of Spain, but as something more. They were Mexicans, shaped by both conquest and survival, by bloodlines that stretched across oceans and centuries. The story of New Spain was one of domination and devotion, cruelty and creativity. The old gods had fallen, but their echoes lived on in the music, the language, and the art of a people who refused to forget who they were. The Spanish had come seeking gold and glory, but what emerged from their conquest was far more enduring, a new civilization born from both suffering and strength. By the dawn of the 19th century, the walls of empire began to crack. Across the Atlantic, Spain weakened under war and political turmoil. In the mountains and villages of Mexico, whispers of independence grew louder. Priests would soon take up the banner of rebellion, and ordinary men and women would rise to fight for freedom. The age of New Spain was drawing to a close, and a new struggle was about to begin, the fight to reclaim the soul of Mexico. The dawn of the 19th century found Mexico still under the shadow of Spain. For nearly 300 years, the land once ruled by mighty empires like the Aztecs and Maya had been reshaped into a colony known as New Spain. The wealth of silver, gold, and fertile lands poured into Spanish ships, while most of the people, indigenous communities, mestizos, and poor laborers, lived under heavy taxes, forced labor, and deep inequality. The Creoles, people of Spanish descent born in Mexico, began to feel restless too. They had wealth and education but no real power. The highest positions in government and the church were reserved for those born in Spain. By the early 1800s, a storm was brewing. Across the Atlantic, revolutionary ideas were spreading fast: liberty, equality, and the right of people to govern themselves. The success of the American Revolution and the waves of change from France inspired thinkers in Mexico. Then, in 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain, forcing the Spanish king to abdicate. For the first time, the colonies began to question who truly held authority. Was it the fallen king in Europe, or could it be the people of Mexico themselves? In this atmosphere of confusion and opportunity, one man lit the spark that would ignite a nation: Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. Hidalgo was a priest from the small town of Dolores, but he was no ordinary priest. He read forbidden books, questioned authority, and believed that all men, regardless of race or status, had the right to freedom. His church became a place not only for prayer, but for revolutionary talk. He discussed independence with friends, local farmers, and even disillusioned soldiers. Then came the night of September 15, 1810. As the plot for rebellion was discovered by Spanish officials, Hidalgo knew there was no turning back. In the early hours of the next morning, he rang the church bell and called his parishioners together. With passion in his voice, he cried out for freedom, justice, and an end to tyranny. This moment became known as El Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores. Under Hidalgo's banner, thousands rallied: poor peasants, mestizos, and indigenous people who had long suffered under Spanish rule. They marched under a banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a symbol that united faith and rebellion. Their cry was simple: death to bad government. The rebel army grew rapidly, but it was also chaotic and inexperienced. When Hidalgo's forces captured cities like Guanajuato, the violence shocked even their leaders. The Spanish authorities struck back with brutal force. Hidalgo was eventually captured, defrocked, and executed in 1811. Yet even as he fell before a firing squad, his dream had taken root. After Hidalgo, leadership passed to another priest, José María Morelos. Unlike Hidalgo, Morelos was a skilled strategist and a disciplined leader. He envisioned not just independence, but a new kind of Mexico free from slavery, racial inequality, and injustice. Morelos called for the creation of a Congress to write a constitution. In 1813, the Congress of Chilpancingo declared independence from Spain and adopted the sentiments of the nation, a document that outlined equality, popular sovereignty, and the end of tyranny. But Spain's response was relentless. Morelos was hunted, captured, and executed in 1815. His death seemed to end the dream of independence. The rebellion fractured into smaller groups, led by guerrilla fighters who kept the flame alive in the mountains and countryside. For several years, the war dragged on without a clear leader or direction. Then came a turning point. In Spain itself, liberal revolutions weakened royal authority and forced King Ferdinand VII to accept constitutional limits. At the same time, in Mexico, the once loyal royalist officer, Agustín de Iturbide, saw that the old order could no longer stand. Iturbide was a Creole and a career soldier who had fought fiercely against the rebels. But by 1820, he realized that independence was inevitable and that he could lead it. In a surprising twist of history, Iturbide reached out to one of the remaining rebel leaders, Vicente Guerrero. Together they formed an alliance known as the Plan of Iguala, a vision that sought independence while preserving social order. The plan rested on three guarantees: religion, independence, and unity. Catholicism would remain the official faith. All Mexicans would be united regardless of race, and Mexico would become an independent constitutional monarchy. The plan struck a chord across society. Both rebels and royalists could support it. The armies of Spain began to crumble as soldiers switched sides. By the summer of 1821, the last Spanish viceroy realized the fight was over. On September 27, 1821, Agustín de Iturbide entered Mexico City at the head of the Army of the Three Guarantees, greeted by cheering crowds and ringing bells. After centuries of colonial rule, Mexico was finally free. But independence came with challenges. The people had won their freedom, yet the question of what kind of nation they would build was still unanswered. The struggle that began with the Cry of Dolores had united peasants, priests, and soldiers, but it had also left deep divisions. The dream of liberty was real but fragile. Still, the significance of this victory cannot be overstated. In 1821, a new chapter began. Mexico joined the growing wave of independent nations across the Americas. The old world of empire had ended, and though the road ahead would be filled with political turmoil, ambition, and revolution, the people of Mexico had proven that their destiny was their own to shape. The bell that Miguel Hidalgo rang in Dolores still echoes in the hearts of Mexicans today, reminding them of a time when courage, faith, and unity brought a nation to life. Mexico's independence in 1821 was supposed to mark the start of a new era of unity and freedom. Instead, it opened a period of chaos, ambition, and constant change. The nation was free, yes, but it was also fragile, divided, and unsure of what kind of government it wanted. Centuries of colonial rule had left deep scars. The people had overthrown Spain, but not the struggles between rich and poor, church and state, or the question of who truly spoke for Mexico. At the center of this uncertainty stood Agustín de Iturbide, the former royalist officer who had helped secure independence. To many, he seemed like the man who could hold the nation together. Charismatic, confident, and popular with the army, Iturbide declared himself Emperor of Mexico in 1822. Agustín I. He imagined a constitutional monarchy that would bring stability and prestige to the new country. But almost immediately, his empire began to crumble. Mexico was too large, too diverse, and too politically divided for one man to rule by decree. Regional leaders, known as caudillos, refused to obey the new emperor. The treasury was empty, trade had slowed, and the army was restless. In less than a year, rebellion erupted again. Among the voices calling for change was Antonio López de Santa Anna, a young officer who would soon dominate Mexican politics for decades. By early 1823, Iturbide was forced to abdicate and flee. His dream of empire had lasted barely a year. He went into exile in Europe, but made the fatal mistake of returning to Mexico in 1824, believing he could help the country again. Instead, he was arrested and executed. His death marked the end of Mexico's first empire and the beginning of the First Republic. In 1824, Mexico adopted a new constitution, inspired by the United States, creating a federal republic with a president and Congress. On paper, it looked promising, a nation built on liberty and representation. But the reality was far messier. The young republic was constantly torn between two rival factions: the liberals, who wanted a secular democratic nation, and the conservatives, who favored strong central authority and the continued influence of the Catholic Church. And standing in the middle of it all was Santa Anna. Over the next 30 years, he would rise and fall from power more times than any leader in Mexican history, sometimes hailed as a hero, other times despised as a traitor. He was president, general, dictator, and exile in one lifetime. During the 1830s, instability became the norm. States rebelled, constitutions were rewritten, and political alliances shifted overnight. One of these regional conflicts had far-reaching consequences: the rebellion in Texas. In 1836, settlers in Texas, many of them from the United States, declared independence from Mexico. Santa Anna marched north to crush the rebellion, leading to legendary battles like the Alamo and San Jacinto. But his defeat at San Jacinto forced him to sign treaties recognizing Texas's independence. Though Mexico never formally accepted them, the loss of Texas would haunt the country for years. A decade later, tensions with the United States exploded into full-scale war. The U.S.-Mexican War began in 1846, sparked by disputes over Texas and the ambition of the United States to expand westward under the idea of manifest destiny. Mexico was still politically divided and militarily unprepared. The American army, better equipped and organized, invaded from multiple directions, first into northern Mexico, then along the Gulf Coast, landing at Veracruz and marching toward the capital. The war was brutal and demoralizing. Mexican soldiers fought courageously but were often outnumbered and undersupplied. One of the most remembered moments came in 1847, during the defense of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City. A group of young military cadets, known as the Niños Heroes, refused to surrender and fought to the death. Their bravery became a symbol of national pride and sacrifice. By the end of the war, U.S. forces occupied the capital. In 1848, Mexico was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding nearly half of its territory, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. It was a devastating blow. The dream of a vast and powerful Mexico was shattered. The years that followed were marked by disillusionment and reform. Many Mexicans believed the only way forward was to rebuild from within to address the corruption, inequality, and chaos that had made the country so weak. Among the new generation of leaders, one name began to stand out: Benito Juárez. Juárez was unlike most politicians of his time. Born into poverty in Oaxaca and of Zapotec indigenous heritage, He rose through education and determination to become a lawyer and reformer. He believed deeply in democracy, the rule of law, and the separation of church and state. To Juarez and his allies, Mexico could only survive if it broke the power of the old institutions that had ruled since colonial times: the army, the church, and the wealthy elite. In 1855, liberals took power and began an ambitious effort to transform the country. They introduced the reform laws, which aimed to modernize Mexico and end the privileges of the church and military. The Ley Juarez abolished special courts for clergy and soldiers. The Ley Lerdo forced the sale of church lands to encourage economic growth. The Constitution of 1857 established freedom of speech, equality before the law, and civil rights for all citizens. But these changes also tore the nation apart. The conservatives, furious at the loss of their influence and fearful of losing their identity, rose in rebellion. The conflict between liberals and conservatives turned into a bloody civil war known as the War of Reform, 1858 to 1861. Juarez led the liberal government from the city of Veracruz, refusing to back down even as the country descended into chaos. By 1861, the liberals finally emerged victorious. Juarez became president and entered Mexico City determined to rebuild the nation. But peace would not last. Years of war had left Mexico bankrupt, and foreign powers were demanding repayment of debts. When Juarez suspended payments, France, Britain, and Spain sent troops to pressure Mexico. Britain and Spain eventually withdrew, but France, under Emperor Napoleon III, saw a chance to establish a new empire in the Americas. In 1862, French forces invaded, expecting an easy victory. But in the city of Puebla, on May 5, Mexican troops under General Ignacio Zaragoza defeated the invaders. The victory was brief but symbolic. It became celebrated as Cinco de Mayo, a reminder that Mexico could stand against the mightiest armies in the world. Still, France did not give up. The following year, their reinforcements returned, and by 1863 they captured the capital. The conservatives, seeking to undo the liberal reforms, supported the French intervention. Napoleon III installed an Austrian Archduke, Maximilian of Habsburg, as Emperor of Mexico. Once again, the nation found itself under foreign rule. Maximilian, though European by birth, was idealistic and well-meaning. He tried to rule fairly and even supported some liberal reforms. But he was trapped between two worlds: the French, who had put him on the throne, and the Mexican people, who saw him as an invader. Juarez refused to surrender. From the north, he led a government in exile determined to restore the republic. By 1866, the French withdrew their troops under pressure from the United States, which had just ended its own civil war. Maximilian was left alone, betrayed by his allies. In 1867, Republican forces captured him in Querétaro. Despite pleas for mercy from European monarchs, Juarez stood firm. Maximilian was executed by firing squad, and the Second Mexican Empire collapsed. With Juarez's return to Mexico City, the Republic was restored once again. The long years of empire, invasion, and reform had taken their toll. Cities lay in ruins, the treasury was empty, and the people were weary of war. But for the first time in decades, Mexico stood truly independent, governed not by kings or emperors, but by its own laws and ideals. Juarez became a symbol of resilience and national pride, a man who had risen from humble origins to defend his country against foreign domination. His vision of a modern, secular, and democratic Mexico laid the foundation for the future. Yet even as peace returned, new challenges loomed on the horizon: struggles for power, wealth, and identity that would continue to shape the destiny of Mexico for generations to come. The story of this era is one of survival. Through empire and invasion, reform and resistance, Mexico endured. Out of the turmoil of the 19th century emerged a nation that refused to day at people who again and again rebuilt their country from the ashes of defeat. When the dust of war finally began to settle, Mexico was exhausted. The long struggle through empire, reform, and foreign invasion had left deep scars across the land. The people craved peace, stability, and progress. Out of this longing rose one man who promised to bring order to chaos: a soldier, politician, and master strategist who would dominate Mexico for more than 3 decades. His name was Porfirio Diaz. Diaz was born in Oaxaca, the same state as Benito Juarez, and like Juarez, he came from humble beginnings. He was of mixed indigenous heritage and had once studied for the priesthood before choosing the path of a soldier. His rise began during the Wars of Reform and the French Intervention, where he earned fame for his bravery and skill. By the Ibartiling S, Diaz had become a respected general, admired for his discipline and ambition. But while Juarez had fought to build a democratic republic, Diaz saw that democracy in a divided country often led to instability. He believed what Mexico needed most was strong leadership, firm hand, to bring peace and modernization. When Juarez died in 1872, and his successor, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, continued his policies, Diaz rebelled. In 1876, under the banner of the Plan of Tuxtepec, he led an uprising and seized power. Thus began the Porfiriato, a period that would define an era. Diaz ruled Mexico, with only a short interruption. From 1876 to 1911, his motto was simple: order and progress, and for a time, he delivered both. Under Diaz, Mexico transformed. Railroads snaked across the land, connecting distant regions that had once been isolated. In 1876, the country had only a few hundred miles of track. By the early 1900s, it had over 15,000. The telegraph and telephone brought communication to towns that had never been heard from before. Cities modernized, factories multiplied, and foreign investment poured in from the United States, Britain, and France. For the first time, Mexico began to look like a modern nation. Electric lights illuminated Mexico City. Elegant theaters, wide boulevards, and European-style architecture gave the capital a new face. Scientists, known as Los Científicos, advised Diaz's government, promoting positivism, the idea that progress came through science, order, and rational thought. The elite classes celebrated their new prosperity with French fashion, European art, and grand social events. But beneath this glittering surface, another Mexico suffered. The modernization that Diaz celebrated came at a heavy cost. The government sold vast amounts of land to wealthy investors and foreign companies. Entire villages were dispossessed as land laws stripped indigenous communities and small farmers of their rights. The haciendas, the great estates of the rich, grew larger, while the poor became laborers on the land their ancestors once owned. Peasants toiled from dawn to dusk, earning barely enough to survive. In the mines of the north and the plantations of the south, workers faced brutal conditions. Strikes were met with soldiers and bullets. For the wealthy elite, Diaz's regime was a golden age. For the majority, it was an age of silence and repression. Diaz maintained control through a careful balance of reward and fear. He allowed local leaders, or jefes politicos, to rule their regions as long as they remained loyal to him. Elections were held, but they were little more than theater. Dissent was crushed swiftly, and the press was censored. Diaz once remarked, "Little politics, much administration," and he meant it. The country was stable, but freedom was scarce. Still, it was hard to argue with the results on the surface. Mexico's economy grew rapidly. Exports of silver, oil, and agricultural goods boomed. Foreign companies built factories and railroads, and cities like Monterrey and Guadalajara flourished. The wealthy elite enjoyed the modern world that Diaz had promised: electricity, fashion, and luxury. But far away from the shining capitals, discontent simmered. By the turn of the 20th century, the cracks were widening. The gap between rich and poor had become impossible to ignore. Peasants, workers, and indigenous communities began to organize in secret. The Yaqui people of Sonora rose up to defend their lands, but were crushed and deported to plantations in the Yucatan. Miners in Cananea and textile workers in Rio Blanco went on strike, demanding fair wages and dignity. Both uprisings were put down with bloodshed, but the message was clear: the people were growing restless. At the same time, Diaz's image as the wise, eternal leader began to fade. By 1908, he was an old man in his late 70s, having ruled Mexico for more than 3 decades. In an interview with American journalist James Krellman, Diaz surprised the world by declaring that Mexico was ready for democracy and that he would not run in the next election. For many Mexicans, it was a moment of hope, a sign that change was finally possible. One of those inspired by Diaz's words was a wealthy landowner from Coahuila named Francisco I. Madero. Madero came from a privileged background but believed in democracy and social justice. He wrote a book, La Sucesión Presidencial de 1910, calling for free elections and political reform. His message spread quickly across the nation, but Diaz, unwilling to let go of power, changed his mind. He ran for re-election in 1910 and won again, through fraud and intimidation. Madero was arrested and imprisoned. The promise of peaceful change vanished overnight. Across the country, frustration turned to anger. The peasants and workers who had suffered under Diaz's rule now saw a chance to rise. When Madero escaped from prison and fled to the United States, he issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi, calling for Mexicans to take up arms on November 20, 1910, to overthrow the dictatorship. Few realized it at the time, but this call would ignite one of the most dramatic and transformative events in Mexico's history, the Mexican Revolution. As the year turned to 1911, the country that Diaz had ruled with iron discipline began to unravel. Rebellions broke out across the land peasants in the south, under Emiliano Zapata, cowboys and workers in the north under Pancho Villa, and countless others who saw in the revolution a chance to reclaim their dignity. Porfirio Diaz, once the symbol of strength and progress, now found himself surrounded by rebellion. After 35 years in power, he finally accepted defeat. In May 1911, Diaz resigned and went into exile in France. As his ship departed from Veracruz, he reportedly looked back and said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." His words captured both pride and regret, the legacy of a man who had brought Mexico peace, but at a terrible price. The Porfiriato had transformed the nation, building railroads, industries, and cities, but it had also created deep social wounds. The wealth of the few had come at the suffering of the many. Now the balance was breaking. The revolution was coming. The people who had been silent for so long were about to speak, and the nation they would create would be forged in the fire of struggle, hope, and change. By the dawn of the 20th century, Mexico stood at a crossroads. For more than 30 years, Porfirio Diaz had ruled the country with an iron hand. Railroads crisscrossed the land, cities glowed with electric light, and industry boomed. But behind this image of progress lay deep injustice. The land was owned by a handful of elites and foreign investors, while millions of peasants worked as virtual slaves on haciendas. Freedom was a word often spoken, but rarely lived. The people had grown tired of silence. The spark of revolution was about to ignite. It began with Francisco I. Madero, a soft-spoken landowner from Coahuila, who believed that Mexico deserved democracy. Unlike Diaz, Madero dreamed of a government chosen by the people. When Diaz promised free elections in 1910, Madero took him at his word and ran against him. But Diaz had no intention of giving up power. Madero was jailed, the election was rigged, and Diaz was declared the winner once again. While imprisoned, Madero realized that peaceful change was impossible. After escaping to the United States, he issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi, calling on Mexicans to rise up on November 20, 1910. He declared that Diaz's rule was illegal and promised land reform, fair elections, and justice for the poor. The call spread like wildfire. Across Mexico, ordinary men and women took up arms. In the north, a former bandit turned revolutionary named Pancho Villa led his troops through Chihuahua, attacking army garrisons and seizing towns with daring raids. He was a natural leader, bold, unpredictable, and deeply loyal to his men. His charisma made him a hero to the poor and a legend to the world. In the south, a quiet farmer named Emiliano Zapata emerged as the voice of the peasants. From the fertile lands of Morelos, Zapata demanded the return of stolen lands to the indigenous people. His slogan, "Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty," captured the heart of the revolution. While Madero dreamed of democracy, Zapata fought for justice. His army, made up of farmers and villagers, became one of the strongest revolutionary forces in the country. By early 1911, Diaz's regime was collapsing. The once feared dictator faced rebellion on all sides. His soldiers deserted, and his support vanished. In May, Diaz resigned and went into exile in France. After 35 years of rule, the Porfiriato was over. Madero entered Mexico City as a hero, cheered by crowds who saw him as the man who had brought freedom. But freedom, as it turned out, was not so simple. Once in power, Madero struggled to unite the diverse factions of the revolution. He believed in reform through law, not through force. He tried to calm the country, but many felt betrayed. Zapata accused him of breaking his promise of land reform and rose in rebellion, declaring, "If you do not deliver the land, we will take it ourselves." In the north, Villa's forces continued to fight, demanding change. The old elites and the army, frightened by the chaos, plotted against Madero. In 1913, one of his generals, Victoriano Huerta, betrayed him. With support from conservative forces and foreign interests, Huerta seized power in a coup known as La Decena Tragica, the 10 tragic days. Madero was arrested and soon after, murdered. The nation was plunged back into darkness, but the revolution refused to die. The people rose once more, angrier, stronger, and more determined. In the north, Venustiano Carranza, a former ally of Madero, took up the banner of constitutional government. He issued the Plan of Guadalupe, declaring Huerta's regime illegitimate. Carranza was joined by Villa and Zapata, though their visions for Mexico were very different. Villa fought for the rights of workers and soldiers. Zapata fought for the peasants. Carranza, a political man, fought for the restoration of the republic. Together, they drove Huerta from power in 1914, but victory only deepened the divisions. The alliance shattered as each leader sought to shape the future in his own image. Civil war erupted again. Villa and Zapata joined forces against Carranza, marching toward the capital. In a remarkable moment, the two revolutionary legends met in Mexico City. Zapata, modest and reserved, arrived from the south. Villa, charismatic and commanding, came from the north. Together they rode into the National Palace, peasants and soldiers occupying the seat of power. Yet neither wanted to rule. Both soon returned to their regions, leaving Mexico's political fate uncertain. Carranza regrouped, supported by skilled generals like Álvaro Obregón, and launched a campaign to reclaim control. Villa's cavalry fought fiercely, but Obregón's forces, armed with modern weapons and new tactics, defeated him in battle after battle. By 1917, Carranza emerged as the dominant leader, but he understood that lasting power could not come from the gun, it had to come from law. That same year, Mexico adopted a new and revolutionary document, the Constitution of 1917. It was one of the most progressive in the world at the time. It guaranteed the right to education, established limits on foreign ownership of land, and recognized labor rights. Article 27 declared that land and natural resources belonged to the nation, paving the way for future land reforms. Article 123 gave workers the right to strike and demand fair wages. For the first time, the struggles of peasants and workers were written into the nation's law. Though Carranza's government brought a new constitution, the fighting was far from over. Villa continued his campaigns in the north, clashing with federal troops and even launching a daring raid into U.S. territory in 1916, prompting an American military expedition into Mexico. Zapata, still fighting for land reform, refused to recognize Carranza's authority. In 1919, he was lured into an ambush and killed, betrayed by promises of peace that were never meant to be kept. His death sent shockwaves through the countryside, but his cause, land and liberty, would live on in the hearts of millions. Carranza himself would not survive much longer. By 1920, he had lost the trust of his generals and the revolutionary movement that had once supported him. Obregón, the brilliant general who had helped him win the war, turned against him. Carranza fled the capital, hoping to escape north, but he was assassinated before he could reach safety. The revolution had devoured yet another of its own. At last, after 10 years of bloodshed, Mexico was exhausted. The fields were burned, cities were scarred, and more than 1 million lives had been lost. But from that decade of chaos and courage, a new nation was born. When Álvaro Obregón became president, in Igualing, the country began to rebuild, not under kings or dictators, but under a vision shaped by the revolution itself. The Mexico that emerged from the fires of war was not the same as before. The old order of haciendas and aristocracy had been broken. The people, peasants, workers, and the poor had found their voice. The revolution gave Mexico a new identity, proud, independent, and rooted in social justice. The ideas of Zapata, Villa, Madero, and Carranza, often in conflict together, reshaped the soul of the nation. They had dreamed of land for the peasants, rights for workers, and dignity for every citizen. The Constitution of 1917 stood as their collective legacy, a promise that Mexico would never again bow so easily to tyranny. In the end, the Mexican Revolution was more than a war for power. It was a struggle for the heart of the nation. Out of betrayal, sacrifice, and endless hope, Mexico was reborn, a country forged by its people, forever marked by their courage to fight for freedom and justice. When the smoke of the Mexican Revolution finally cleared in 1920, the country stood on shaky but hopeful ground. The dream of land, liberty, and justice had come at a tremendous cost. Entire regions were devastated, families torn apart, and the memory of war lingered in every village and city. But the ideals that had driven the revolution, the right to equality, education, and dignity, were still alive, and they began to shape a new Mexico. The first decades after the revolution were about rebuilding. Leaders like Álvaro Obregón and Plutarco Elias Calles worked to stabilize the country, reform land ownership, and limit the power of the Catholic Church. Calles helped found a new political system that would dominate Mexican life for the rest of the century, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or PRI. It was meant to bring together the different revolutionary factions and prevent future civil wars. For better or worse, it succeeded. Under the PRI, Mexico experienced rare stability in a world often shaken by chaos. From the 1930s to the 1980s, presidents changed peacefully, but always from the same party. The government carried out major reform, schools were built, industries nationalized, and oil became the pride of the nation under President Lázaro Cárdenas, who boldly reclaimed the oil fields from foreign control in 1938. For millions, this was a moment of national pride, proof that Mexico was finally standing on its own feet. Yet beneath the surface, problems grew. The PRI's grip on power left little room for true democracy. Corruption became a quiet companion of progress. While cities modernized and the economy expanded, rural areas often lagged behind. The promise of the revolution, land and liberty for all, still felt out of reach for many. By the 1960s, a new generation of Mexicans began to question authority. They had grown up hearing stories of heroes like Zapata and Villa, yet lived in a country where free speech was limited and power concentrated. In 1968, just days before the Olympic Games in Mexico City, students filled the streets demanding democracy and justice. What began as a peaceful movement ended in tragedy at Tlatelolco Square, where government forces opened fire on unarmed protesters. Hundreds were killed. It was a wound that scarred the nation's conscience, reminding everyone that freedom was still fragile. The decades that followed brought both progress and hardship. In the 1970s and 80s, Mexico's oil wealth created a sense of optimism. But corruption and economic mismanagement soon led to crisis. Inflation soared, debt piled up, and in 1985, a devastating earthquake struck Mexico City, killing thousands. The government's slow response angered citizens, but it also awakened something powerful: the spirit of community. Ordinary people stepped up to help, showing that Mexico's strength had always come from its people, not its politicians. As the 1990s began, Mexico looked toward the future. The signing of NAFTA in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, opened a new era of trade and globalization. Factories multiplied, goods flowed freely across borders, and Mexico's economy became tied more closely to the United States and Canada. But globalization brought its own challenges. While some prospered, others were left behind. The gap between rich and poor widened, and many rural families struggled to keep up in a fast-changing world. The same year NAFTA took effect, a rebellion erupted in the southern state of Chiapas. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation, named after Emiliano Zapata, declared war on the government, demanding justice for indigenous communities. Their message was clear: even after a century of revolution, equality remained unfinished business. The new millennium finally broke the PRI's long hold on power. In 2000, Vicente Fox of the National Action Party (PAN) won the presidency, the first opposition victory in more than 70 years. It marked a turning point in Mexico's democracy. The country had changed, yet the struggles continued. Corruption, inequality, and violence remained major challenges, and the rise of powerful drug cartels cast a dark shadow across much of the nation. Still, through every hardship, Mexico's spirit endured. Its culture flourished, blending ancient traditions with modern creativity. From the murals of Diego Rivera and the films of Alfonso Cuarón to the global celebration of Dia de los Muertos, Mexico's identity became one of resilience, color, and pride. Its people carried forward the legacy of those who fought for justice a century earlier. Today, in the 2020s, Mexico stands as a nation of contrasts, rich in history, vibrant in culture, and full of potential. Its cities pulse with innovation, its youth demand accountability, and its artists and thinkers continue to shape the world's imagination. The revolution's dream of equality and dignity still guides the nation's heart, even as it faces the realities of modern politics and global challenges. Mexico's story is far from over. It's a story of struggle and rebirth, of identity and perseverance. From the temples of the Aztecs to the streets of modern Mexico City, this land has never stopped evolving, never stopped fighting to define itself. And as we look back across thousands of years of history, from the Maya and Aztecs, to the conquistadors, to the revolutionaries who dreamed of a better tomorrow, we see a nation that continues to rise, again and again. A country that remembers its past, not as a burden, but as a foundation for its future. This has been the story of Mexico, a story written in courage, culture, and hope. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more stories that shaped our world, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more history to life, one story at a time.